Hello everyone, welcome to week 7. This week and next week we'll cover political regimes. This week we'll mainly focus on democracy. Next week we'll focus on the crisis of democracy and alternatives or other systems like more authoritarian systems. So today we'll cover four different things. I hope we'll have enough time for the fourth one, but first of all we'll talk about what democracy is and the different types of democracy. Second, we'll talk about democracies and non-democracies in a very slight and short way, and then we'll talk more about mechanisms and requirements of democracy. So what kind of requirements do we need in order to call a system a democratic system? And finally, we'll focus on, so all of these things are in theory, and then we'll look at the practice. So how democracies really work in practice. So basically we'll cover two different theories, elitist theory versus the pluralist theory. So let's start with the definition of democracy. So I think you all know about this definition. In its simplest way, you can define democracy as rule by the people. So, people having direct control of government. So these are some very simplistic definitions of democracy. But democracies are not necessarily a direct rule of the people. Matter of fact, when founding fathers were creating the American democracy, they created a system that actually people do not necessarily have too much power, because people, average Americans or average citizens in any other country do not necessarily pay too much attention to what's going on in politics or, policy. So calling the government a democracy may also lead to kind of unrealistic expectations of how government works and how quickly it responds. And in reality, when you look at how democracies work, most of the modern democracies are kind of designed to be a little slow on purpose, and also a little bit unresponsive, again, on purpose. So we'll talk about that kind of, maybe we can call it a dilemma towards the end of the class, and especially next week, because I think it is at the very heart of the crisis of the Western democracies right now. So basically, there are different types of democracies. Some democracies are illiberal democracies. So I think there is a very general question that you can ask yourself, whether having fair and free elections enough to call a system a democracy. If you ask me that question, I would say no, because there are some systems in the world where you see elections. Of course, it's always contested whether those elections are free or fair, but other requirements, and we'll cover them in this 15 minutes, so are absent. So for instance, I can always think about Russia as an example. Another example is Singapore. From time to time, Singapore is counted as a democracy, but most of the time I think it can be called as illiberal democracy. Turkey is definitely an example. Mexico used to be an example. So these examples are actually quite a lot, and comparative politics scholars started to call the systems hybrid regimes. So basically, when they are called hybrid, what does it mean is there are some mechanisms or requirements of democracy in those systems, but there are also authoritarian elements in those systems. That's why they call them hybrid systems. But all in all, I think we can differentiate between direct democracy and representative democracy. So direct democracy is basically anything that people can vote on, especially issue by issue. Like in town hall meetings, right? People can come together and vote on some issues directly. This is what direct democracy is. But since we are living in very crowded societies, especially when you think about the US, right? The population is over 350 million. So when you think about that kind of society, you cannot necessarily run every single decision or policy issue by the people. So this is why we have representative democracy. It is one in which the people do not rule directly, but through elected and accountable representatives. I think we can call it also republic. So people elect others who make decisions on their behalf. So these are important differentiations between systems. But I hope you already have a little understanding of what democracy is, because it's only 5 minutes and it's impossible to talk about democracy in 5 minutes. But let's move on to comparison of democracy with other systems. There are systems called transitional systems, systems that are still in democratic transition, and there are authoritarian systems, and there are also totalitarian systems. Totalitarian systems, I think nowadays we can take North Korea as an example to a totalitarian system, and their numbers are quite low. There are more authoritarian systems. Iran and China are classical examples. And then transitional systems, I think we can definitely talk more about this, but Tunisia is definitely one, and I think it's moving more and more towards the democratic spectrum. So all in all, what I want to say here is, when we start talking about political systems, we cannot necessarily talk about black and white. All political systems, including US and other Western European systems, which are actually classified as the most democratic systems, are not perfect democracies. None of the systems are perfect. So this is why I think we are talking about, again, like we talked about in ideologies, a dimension where you have a perfect democracy, which is, I think, not possible in today's world, versus totalitarianism. So all the countries, all the other systems in the world, I think, can be placed on that kind of a dimension. Let's talk about some important things to differentiate democracies from other systems. For instance, elections. Elections have to be competitive in democracies. They are fluid or rigged, or maybe fake in other systems, like in transitional, authoritarian, and totalitarian systems. So ideology, we covered them, right? There are so many different ideologies, and they are represented in democratic systems. But in transitional systems, so they might be limited, and in authoritarian systems, it's in the hands, it's none or not necessarily, kind of like pretended. And in totalitarian systems, there is a ideology, a doctrine, and it is a militant ideology. So constitutions in democratic systems are there to restrain government, which is very important. In transitional systems, they might be selectively interpreted, or in authoritarian systems, they actually restrain individuals, not necessarily governments. So basically, in authoritarian system, you can definitely have a constitution, but constitution does not necessarily provide rights to people. It tells people what they cannot do. So it's kind of understanding of negative versus positive freedoms. And then we can look at civil liberties. Civil liberties are protected in democracies. In other systems, they are vulnerable, or they are very few, and in totalitarian systems, there are none. Interest groups. There are many and autonomous in democratic systems. In transitional systems, most of the time they are few, or they are strongly connected to the governments. In authoritarian systems, they are state supervised, and there are no autonomous interest groups in totalitarian systems. So it can go and on, but finally maybe I can talk a little about military. So military is subordinate to elected officials, civilians. And in transitional systems, like Egypt used to be a transitional system. I don't think we can call it a transitional system anymore. So for instance, the current president Sisi in Egypt is actually a military general, used to be a military general. And that means that actually military plays a very important political role, and it's intervened with the regime in Egypt. So these are some, very simple differentiations between democracies and non-democracies. So I'm already going over my time, so I have only 5 minutes left. In this 5 minutes, I will talk a little about mechanisms. So I can think of 4 mechanisms of democracy. The first one is accountability. So basically, it's very easy, right? It's holding an elected officer accountable for his or her actions. So basically, it is the right of the people and the power of the people to remove a politician from office if they think it is necessary. So this is number one. Number two is political competition. So these mechanisms are so intervened together, so one cannot necessarily function without the other one. So political competition means there has to be more than one meaningful competitors. When I say meaningful, it means that actually the competitor should have enough chance to win the elections, so that the third mechanism is alternation in power can happen. So if there is no alternation in power in any given system, then we cannot necessarily talk about democracy. And finally, this is a very important and interesting part, because these three can be actually facilitated by the institutions. But the fourth one is not necessarily only by the institutions, but also the preference of the people, the behavior of people also get in, which is participation. So you can create institutions so that you can facilitate and you can make things easier for people to participate in politics. But if people do not have the will or do not have the motivation to participate, then unfortunately there is not much to do for a democratic system. This is why I think it's very important that democratic systems, all regimes, are dynamic things. You cannot necessarily think about them as static and non-changing. They are in constant change. This is why it is very important to think about the future of democracy, because we cannot take it for granted. The citizens should actually have to act in order to continue to live in a democratic system. So then there are other requirements for democracy. So I'll be very quick. Maybe we can talk and discuss about this on Tuesday when we have our synchronous meeting. So popular representation, they are classified as mandate or trustee models. And then the majority decision is another important requirement. The third requirement is right to dissent or disobedience. We will definitely talk about this important requirement. And then political equality. So all citizens should be treated equal in front of law, especially by the state. And the popular consultation, so basically whether the system is actually listening to people. And the free press. Free press is also a very important requirement of any given democracy. So finally, let's talk about how things really work in practice. So basically, we can talk about two major systems or theories of democracies, and they are elitist theories and pluralist theories. So elitist theories have a more pessimistic view of how democracies really work. So they are quite important theories, and they kind of say, money kind of gives elites access to political power. I think this is quite clear, especially in nowadays American system. And those who wield it, this is enhanced by the connections held by the wealthy. And then a great deal of influence from elites comes in the form of campaign contributions. This is exactly what's happening still in the US. And politics is essentially a single pyramid with the elites sitting at the top of it and the masses at the bottom of it. And there's a very important sociologist, C. Wright Mills, who wrote about the power elites. I can actually present some other important characteristics of that book maybe on Tuesday. And then pluralists, they argue that politics function through interest groups that compete with each other for access to government and bargain with each other. So Robert Dahl is a very important figure in pluralist approach, and he called it a polyarchy, the American system a polyarchy, and interest groups collide with each other like billiard balls in their attempts to influence policy. And it is through their efforts that citizens are heard, because any citizen can form a group to try and influence politics. So this is more optimistic view, as you can see. So basically, I'm almost at the 15 minutes mark. So these are the things that I like to tell you for this week. And I hope to see you all on Tuesday when we have our synchronous meeting. And I wish you all a nice day and take care. See you all on Tuesday.